The date, Wednesday, June 3rd, 1942. The time, 05:45 hours. American forces at Dutch Harbor received a rude awakening as Japanese fighter pilots initiated a bombing of their naval base. The commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, had known of the enemy's intention to attack the holding for weeks. But due to poor weather and poor communication, his men could not adequately prepare for the attack to come. During the course of the 48-hour onslaught, the Imperial forces managed to destroy several oil supply tanks, a ship, and part of a hospital on Dutch Harbor, leading Nimitz and his subordinate officers to believe that the Japanese were preparing to capture the base. Little did they know that the fleet, led by Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, had other plans in mind. Diverging to the south, Hosogaya joined forces with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto after his loss at the Battle of Midway, and then proceeded to occupy Kiska on June 6th, followed by Attu on June 7th. In both cases, the takeovers were completely unopposed. It did not take long for U.S. commanders to realize that they had a massive problem on their hands. For the first time since the War of 1812, a foreign combatant had landed on U.S. soil. Welcome back to Historian's Corner, where today we'll be discussing the Japanese invasion of Alaska you didn't know about. The Aleutian Chain is a roughly 1,000-mile arc of islands that stretches from the Alaskan Peninsula all the way across the Bering Sea to the northeast edge of Asia. With the exception of a few of the westernmost isles, the overwhelming majority of these islands belonged to the Alaska Territory in 1941, and were therefore considered organized, incorporated land in the United States. This fact meant that at the onset of World War II, the chain was of special interest to the Empire of Japan, as for a time, their top military officials speculated that the American Army could at any moment build a base on the Aleutians and use it as a jump-off point to attack the Japanese mainland. And, conversely, if the Imperial Army could establish a foothold in the Aleutian Islands, the forces stationed there could potentially attack West Coast cities like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. At least, that's what they thought. You see, the Japanese military's knowledge of the Aleutians was severely lacking, and it turns out that several different factors served to limit the island's potential as successful military bases. With thick fogs rolling in one day and intense blizzards hitting the next, most of the island suffered from chronic low visibility, thereby complicating the duties of both airmen and navalmen. Combine this with their almost total lack of natural resources and limited access to the outside world, and suddenly it became clear that Imperial forces would have trouble making a station there lucrative on its own. But then, Yamamoto had an idea. Because he eventually intended to carry out another strike on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese admiral knew he needed to establish a military outpost closer to the U.S. naval base. Midway Atoll, a minuscule island just 1,100 miles west of Hawaii, was his natural choice. The only issue was that the Americans had already set up a naval air facility there, and would likely not let go of it very easily. So Yamamoto pulled out every deceptive tool in his arsenal to launch an effective sneak attack. The invasion of the Aleutian Islands was one such tool. Handing control of the northern area to his Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, he ordered the fleet north to the Aleutians, hoping that this would draw part of the U.S. Navy out of Pearl Harbor to defend Alaska. With the size of the enemy's attacking force decreased, the Japanese admiral would then move his larger Pacific fleet forward to Midway in waves, thereby disguising its true size. Thus, Yamamoto hoped to simultaneously accomplish three objectives: obliterate the Americans' naval capabilities, take a strategic outpost within striking distance of Hawaii, and establish a Japanese presence in North America that was strategically equidistant between Midway and the U.S. mainland. His elaborate scheme may very well have worked wonders. That is, had the Americans not already cracked the Japanese code and learned of the ambush prior to its unraveling. As such, the primary attack backfired catastrophically. The auxiliary campaign in the Aleutian Islands, however, was an entirely different story. Learning of both the forthcoming strike on Midway and the Aleutian diversion put U.S. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz in quite the pickle. Now, on the one hand, he correctly judged that Hawaii was the more crucial battleground, and determined that his fleet should invariably come to that territory's defense. On the other hand, he did not want to risk a Japanese military settlement in Alaska that could potentially serve as a launch pad for bombings of the West Coast. Therefore, Nimitz resolved on the 25th of May to send the vast majority of American vessels, including all 3 of their active aircraft carriers, to Midway, while shipping the smaller Task Force 8 to the Aleutians. The admiral expected an all-out assault on the existing military base at Dutch Harbor, and so he commanded his Rear Admiral, Robert Theobald, to defend it at all costs. Nimitz's foresight could not have been more timely. On June 3rd, the Japanese attack began. Over the course of the next 2 days, Imperial aircraft carried out strategic bombings designed to weaken forces on the settlement. They set oil tankers ablaze, destroyed barracks, and ultimately claimed the lives of 43 Americans. Task Force 8 did not participate directly in this battle, as they were stationed elsewhere, awaiting a naval attack aimed at capturing Dutch Harbor. And when reports reached Theobald of approaching enemy ships in the Bering Sea, the Rear Admiral saw that threat as imminent, and swiftly sent his men to intercept them. What he could not anticipate, however, was that Yamamoto would actually send Hosogaya south of Dutch Harbor to claim the undefended islands of Attu and Kiska instead. And just like that, Theobald's mission had shifted from defending American territory to expelling the enemy from it. If there's any silver lining to the loss of 2 Alaskan islands, it's this. By successfully holding their ground at Midway, the U.S. Navy rendered the Japanese foothold in Alaska almost entirely useless. Much of the appeal Yamamoto saw in building airfields in the Aleutians was in using it as a midpoint between Hawaii and the American West Coast. Without Midway, there was little benefit to keeping the islands, besides prohibiting the U.S. from turning them into launching pads to attack Japan. And similarly, the American victory at Midway significantly reduced their concern for another bombing of Pearl Harbor or on major western cities. As George L. McGarrigle writes in his summary of the conflict, quote, "The real motive for planning the recapture of the 2 remote islands was mainly psychological, to remove the only Japanese foothold on American soil in the Western Hemisphere," end quote. With their objective clear and their work cut out for them, the United States set about formulating a plan to take back their land. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C. agreed that the armed forces should focus on reclaiming Kiska and Attu as quickly as possible, thus limiting the possibility of an Alaskan mainland invasion. Following their command, the U.S. Air Force made several bombing runs on Kiska, the closest of the 2 isles, throughout the summer and fall of 1942. All the while, the Army ran successful missions to occupy unclaimed islands in the Aleutian chain, then building airfields on them from which they could mount future attacks. Any serious campaign against the Japanese holdings would have to wait until after winter had passed, though, as the previously discussed fog and poor weather conditions shielded the enemy from assault. To make the Americans' job even more difficult, Japan keenly took this opportunity to strengthen their island's fortifications, increasing their manpower to 4,000 and 1,000 on Kiska and Attu, respectively. 1942 turned to 1943, and eventually winter gave way to spring. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, who had recently replaced Theobald, knew the time was ripe to act. By the middle of March, he had effectively instituted a naval blockade in an attempt to cut off Japanese efforts to resupply their troops. Yamamoto and Hosogaya recognized their men would not last long without provisions, and so on the 26th, they sent a large fleet of ships to try and break the blockade. Their efforts were to no avail. In what became known as the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands, the Americans held their ground. Kinkaid's method of weakening the enemy had succeeded, thus allowing him to move forward with an invasion. Throughout the month of April, he pulled together the original Task Force 8, as well as reinforcements from the 7th Infantry Unit stationed in San Francisco, and subjected all of them to intense training ahead of the battle to come. Air and naval units bombarded the islands for weeks ahead of D-Day, and then, on May 11, 1943, Operation Sand Crab, the mission to recapture Attu, got underway. The American ground forces were initially split into subdivisions and ordered to land at different tactical beaches on the east coast of Attu. After snuffing out some smaller Japanese settlements further inland, The aim was to circle the troops back toward the coast, encircling their enemy until they had no choice but to surrender. Though it sounds like a simple plan, it took almost 19 days to fully execute. In a style of fighting that would become characteristic of them in later Pacific theater battles, the Japanese bogged down and refused to give an inch. After the first 4 days, Major General Albert Brown wrote back to his command, quote, "Progress through passes will, unless we are extremely lucky, be slow and costly," end quote. Over the next several days, the position of U.S. troops would go from bad to worse. All 4 advancing forces had bogged down, and an advancing Japanese naval battalion was approaching to threaten the fleet supporting Brown's forces. These desperate times called for desperate measures, and on the 16th, Kinkaid acted accordingly, firing Brown and replacing him with Major General Eugene Landrum. The effects of this decision were profound and practically instantaneous. Stalemates broke left and right, propelling the advancement of American troops and forcing the retreat of the Japanese towards Chicago Harbor. 2 more weeks of hard fighting ensued, but finally on May 29th, all active resistance ceased. Almost a year to the day after losing it, Attu had been reclaimed. You may now be expecting to hear an even greater story about the fight to win back Kiska. However, in a peculiar turn of events, the landing forces on the larger island found it to be completely deserted. As it turns out, upon hearing of the Attu fiasco, Hosogaya boldly decided to evacuate his men, turning the invasion of Kiska into a military dress rehearsal for the United States. How the Japanese admiral managed to do this without arousing the suspicion of the watchful U.S. Navy is a mystery. One would imagine, however, that the American men on the ground didn't mind their preemptive surrender all that much. It may have caused the only land invasion of America in the 20th century to end in a whimper rather than a dramatic bang, but ultimately, it was the ending that allowed many more Americans to return home unharmed at the end of the war, and nothing could possibly matter more than that. Now, we'd like to open the floor to you. Had you heard of the Aleutian Islands campaign before? Do you think the war might have gone differently had the Japanese held down the Isles for longer? Or, for that matter, do you think that either side could have made any sort of good use for the Aleutians throughout the course of the war? Let us know your opinion down in the comments section below. For more historical content, drop a like and subscribe to our channel. As always, thank you for watching Historian's Corner.